truth. So aesthetics could easily be sublated in favor of truth articulated in philosophy. And although Romanticism's tendency towards abstraction terminated with a very long period of realist art in the mid-19th century, we know that art entered modernity in the 20th century with the explicit determination to theorize and to abstract. So that modern art had been art after, or instead philosophy, much earlier than Joseph Kossuth proclaimed it to be such. Meanwhile, Marx, unlike Hegel, did not think that science or theory could touch upon reality better than art's sensuous means. And in Marx, you always have this urgency of aesthetic aspiration being transmitted sensuously. He's articulately stating that logical thinking is not the goal of history, as Hegel would insist, but also the sensuous and material forming of nature and development of productive forces of humankind. Nevertheless, we all know what happens in modernism. We know how important it was to recur to conceptual, theoretical, and speculative values of art. But on the other hand, even when art developed affective, physiological, irrational practices, they still, although they belong to sensations, they developed under the gaze of theory. And this is the standpoint of Greuze, which he developed in one of his recent texts. It has the same title, Under the Gaze of Theory. This means that both cognitive and sensuous aspects of art are viable for contemporary art and for contemporaneity, but they happen to be separated. And at the same time, be it body subversion or forms of life, even these experiences in art represent certain conceptual or theoretical standpoints. So that contemporary art detaches itself from the rationalism of the Enlightenment, but it remains a theoretical and cognitive practice and is still opposed to art's sensuous values, sensuous parameters, as they used to be in pre-modernist time. When using the word sensuous, it is important to keep in mind that it is not feeling, it is not emotion, performance of something affective, or something sensual as against only intellectual. For Hegel, the sensuous means embodying the idea or the concept. So it means rather the convergence of conceptual parameters with the material ones, the meeting point of idea and matter. But it should be noted that the viability of many modernist, avant-garde, and conceptual art practices didn't merely reduce the procedures to theoretical mind. In its most acute, in its most strong, in its most radical sense, the negativity of modernism, the reductionism of modernist procedures also deplored this theorizing. They deplored such condition and subverted the inevitable totality of theory into this radical negative gesture, into the radical moment of actualization, which we can call chaos. And this element of rupture in the negativity of modernist art is something that is emphasized by Greuze, even by Pedagoga. It is a critical moment of misunderstanding that constructs understanding. And it is in this moment that the intensity of modernist and contemporary art piece resided. The moment is negative because it has to do with the collapse of perception and of hermeneutically biased capacity to understand. But by means of certain almost impossible cognitive leap, the understanding and misunderstanding coincide in such a happy moment in favor of some supracognitive paradoxical moment. And actually the reason why contemporary art excelled over all artistic genres and appropriated the right to be called art. We do not call theater, music, poetry art anymore. The reason why this hegemony of contemporary art took place is that it compressed realization of artistic contents of an artwork and its impact into this cognitive critical moment. Modernist as well as contemporary art has definitely this legacy of negative critical moment, which is not based on perception, but on the heuristic grasping of that very conceptual instant. And this conceptual instant can be conceptualism proper, it can be transgressive art, it can be speculative ruminations, whatever, but it constructs the modern and contemporary art as well. But what happens when art dispenses itself of this negative moment, but at the same time it cannot disperse into avant-garde procedure and cannot exert the avant-garde genealogy as well, as we stated yesterday, because the avant-garde political conditions are lacking. The situation is the following in which we find ourselves, that the so-called quasi-modernist autonomous art becomes digestible, democratized, whereas the engaged quasi-avant-garde art reproduces the political agenda formally. So something that was formalist becomes democratized, and something that was democratized becomes formalist. And this is the reason of crisis and of arts becoming loose. And this is when Rancière comes with his aid. Let's aestheticize everything. Let's again use the power of aestheticizing, aesthetics. Maybe this can help, but he is disregarding the situation that he applies aesthetics to the works of arts that have never been meant and implied as aesthetic on the one hand. On the other, he completely relies on Kantian aesthetics and disregards Hegelian aesthetics, in which sensuousness, Hegelian sensuousness, is not at all presupposing the edifice of aesthetics as perception as it was constructed by Kant. Let's now skip and refer to the former socialist interpretation of certain issues of Hegel's aesthetics. And I refer here to the theory of realism of Mikhail Lifshitz. In his work Aesthetics of Hegel and Contemporaneity, he constructed the apology of realist art, and we touched upon this issue yesterday a bit, and he defines art as the sensuous consciousness of truth, when the truthfulness of art derives not from artists' consciousness, not from some kind of sovereign methodology or stylistics, but from a lively sense of objective reality. This term human resignation, which parallels and somehow is the paraphrase of Sinnlichkeit, Hegel's Sinnlichkeit, is the term borrowed from Belinsky. And a realist art, as Lifshitz understands it, is not something that naturalistically, it's not realist because it naturalistically documents or depicts something. It requires involvement and entering into the life sensuousness. So to repeat again, sensuous involvement would not mean the nominal presence in the problem zones or anywhere. It would not so much be about any empirical sharing of experiences, but rather about the eventual encounter with the phenomena or with the happened that presupposes metanoiac transformation imprinted afterwards in the art piece. So that actually the term classical that we regard as the embodiment of order would presuppose this very human resignation which unfolds as sensuous engagement with the reality. And this would be classical in socialist aesthetics. In this sense, classical would mean involved and tragically irreversible. So, realist art articulates and reveals the event extrinsic to itself, and only thereafter becomes a work of art, while modernism as a whole, and often even avant-garde, are constructed in terms of them themselves being their own event. The event residing in their own languages, methodologies, or activist procedures. The term human resignation, to put it against, was also disputing the approach to emancipation exercised by avant-garde's constructivist wing, and blamed it in the exaggeration of the role of biopolitics and social engineering. In the constructivist practices, the issues of systemic arrangement of biopolitical management prevailed over the procedures of life and reality, and even though the avant-garde made its own attempt to dissolve art with life, and whether, despite the fact that it disputed modernism's nihilism, avant-garde often superseded life with itself, turning life into creative production without first taking the time to see what life and reality would consist of. And this was the argument of Lifshitz. As a result, what Lifshitz is claiming against avant-garde is the following, that reality was often taken for an artificial project of constructing that very reality. So reality is reality when you construct it ex nihilo. In this situation, there can be no such thing as objective reality, and in its project of construction and modernization, constructivism and productivism superseded the temporality of a given reality by technical means, as it were, so that reality itself became no more than infrastructure or an art practice. But another very important issue here, in terms of reconsideration of what is realist aesthetics, is how alienation is treated. It's a huge theme, and maybe this had to be a separate paper on what is alienation. But we know from Lyotarian aesthetics and even Deleuzean aesthetics that alienation of capitalism was something irreversible. It was something unsublatable. Even Hegelians like Zizek, like Mladen Dolar, they evacuate this third moment of sublation from Hegel and claim that Hegel is the philosopher of difference, and the sublation is something that never happens there, so that sublating alienation would be something kitschy, poppy. De-alienation would be some sort of belief in the possibility of utopia and a stupid, positive kind of optimism. And on the other hand, what we have in the ideas of monstrosity and in the Leuzian ideas of treating alienation is the intensifying of alienation. So if alienation is so monstrous, there should be some kind of uncanny monstrosity that would be absolutely ungraspable, unsurmountable, or so terrifying that no axiomatics of capital would ever cover it. So alienation was the complement of capitalism long before the emergence of modernist art, and the question that socialist aesthetics put was why the realist artist was making an effort to search for art's de-alienated potentialities, despite the alienating conditions, whereas the modernist artist rejects the potentiality and possibility to de-alienate. So the classical artist wants to construct this possibility and sensuous situation whether things might have been de-alienated. The contemporary modern artist treats this as impossible and rather aestheticizes alienation or goes into critique of it. Or very often we see that paradoxically the modernist and contemporary artist not only despises the alienated world in rhetoric, but there is an unconscious libidinal attraction to it. And we know how important this attraction to alienation becomes for modernist art since Baudelaire. But is this sublation really possible? Would it be possible to say that Marx claims sublation? Because very often when I talked with Marxist thinkers who collaborate with Militant or Zizek, they claim this issue of de-alienation as absolutely obsolete, as absolutely passé, and as absolutely impossible, because they refer to the early Marx. They say this is possible only in early Marx, and despite the fact that Hegel has this issue that objective world is alienated, but by means of speculation, thinking is able to somehow de-alienate it. Then comes Marx and claims that, on the contrary, the inner truthworthiness should come out into the external world and brought in accord with the sensuous contact with the objective world. So the de-alienation is possible in objective world by means of sublation of divided labor and terminating private property. This is the commonplace of Marx. But of course, we know that what happened in the Western art would regard this as absolutely utopian and impossible, and this was exerted, this attitude of non-sublatable alienation was exerted in psychoanalysis, in Adorno, in Zizek, etc. Because this was redemption. Yes, the de-alienating something would be regarded as a totalitarian redemption. But let's think, maybe it's not always so. Maybe de-alienation is not about inventing fake situations of harmony, but maybe it is just about involving into the conditions of alienations as tragic, unendurable, and unacceptable. It is clear that existence cannot be fully de-alienated, but nevertheless, one could project a certain gap between the existing conditions and certain social ideal, and then exert this ideal performatively, sensuously. as a dramatic or staged construction or analysis of such a potentiality. So actually, this very experience of an artist, of a metanoic, sensuous involvement into the reality and the bond with the event, it already presupposes the clash with the alienation and assessment of the alienated conditions as pain. And this pain for the not oneself is already generating the mood, the intonation of de-alienation, despite the fact that alienation never stops. And of course, you have this mood and intonation in pre-modern art, pre-modern music, etc. And definitely this was the issue for the Soviet art's anti-aestheticism, or the Soviet film's anti-aestheticism, which I mentioned. For instance, you can definitely say that Godard's piece is an art piece. You would understand why it is an art piece. It has the language of cinema, it has style, it has certain devices that are explicit. But some kind of film about construction workers who are making a factory work, or, for example, a very famous play, Duck Hunt, a story about the worker who plans to go for hunt. It has nothing aesthetic about it. So why was it? Because the issue was not any methodology or aesthetics, but the concrete case of constructing a human being. So the goal here is not an art piece. What has to be constructed is human beings. What has to be constructed is the concrete drama of how he can de-alienate the situation here. That's why lots of Soviet dramas, literary works and films are a bit like trials. Let's decide how we do it now. And how we subtract the alienated situation from privatized situation into the collective being, into the capacity to be as the non-self being. Not the self, individual being, but non-self being. So, actually, this is the issue about the dialectics of the internal and external. When the internal world becomes socialized and the external one is felt and sensuously suffered as one's own. Whereas in case of alienation and apology of alienation, the external world is even more externalized and the internal world becomes even more solipsist, preserves the individuality unsocialized. In other words, in art, one can always trace whether alienation is surpassable or whether it is aestheticized and desired. And I think Adorno's or Lyotard's attitude is a very good specimen here. They are the big apologists of alienation. And if you listen to new music and the decaphonic music, you see it's about the impossibility of resolving any social conflict because it exerts a non-resolved harmony. And generally the poetics of modernism is about impossibility of sublation. And I end up here. So again, to repeat what epitomizes human resignation. Human resignation brings a strange understanding that when individual personality recedes, then reality is revealed. Then the individual artistic methodology recedes, then reality comes out. And that reality cannot be reconstructed or changed unless there is an effort to first understand and sense it. this act definitely presupposes self-refusal, and Artyom, when he wrote about Platonov, he even used this term self-refutation. So resignation in this case does not imply abstaining from battle, but instead some sort of humbleness, the rejection of an arrogant attitude to the contradictions inherent in the real, not supplanting them with personal desires, biographies, senses, traumas, and psychologies. The realist artist is remaining aware of the futility of artistic means to address reality. It is very important for a realist artist to understand that art is futile, and the artwork is futile. It is not able to emancipate, and it is exactly this desperation of realizing its futility that can bring to the hope for emancipation. That is because event and reality always exceed any work of art. But nonetheless, the work of art stays to be inevitable because only art is the means to refer to the event. And now the last statement. So if we return back to contemporary situation, the question would be whether art should go on with the paradigm of this theoretical mind, putting forward intelligences and cognitive and technological know-hows, but we know this radicality of negative modernist moment, which I stated as Kairos, is lost. It's gone. At the same time, in the absence of general program of economic deprivatization, practices that today stand for the continuation of emancipatory, avant-garde aesthetics are becoming part and parcel of cognitive capitalism's modes of production. But the problem is also that the speeds of circulation and exchange of contemporary capitalist economy are often more subversive, more creative and paradoxical than art's interventions into it. So when following the cognitive path, when following the theoretical path, art and contemporary art in question, because we are in the conditions of contemporary art, cannot but be subordinate to cognitive capitalism's accelerative stream. Art that is based either on intervening into social infrastructures or generating machines of intelligences lags behind in comparison with contemporary economy, because capitalist economy has appropriated so many components of speculative maneuvers. It is more machinic, more externalized, more speedy in terms of circulation, and even more creative in terms of both generating infrastructures and subverting them. Then we can say the difference between art and capital is in ethics, but it is exactly the ethics that art dispenses itself with, in favor of either competing with the technocratic efficiencies of progress or in favor of profaning capitalist alienation with even harsher estrangement and alienation. So, therefore today the watershed would be not so much between art's political commitment and aesthetic autonomy, but rather between the episteme of contemporary art and the eventual and sensuous rendering of the happened that art had voluntarily discarded long ago. Thank you.